If you've watched the last few videos in this series, you'll notice a pattern. First, I talked about capitalism and how modern capitalism doesn't actually reward productivity, but market dominance. Then, socialism and why it's constantly misrepresented. Yesterday, I talked about why the tax the rich conversation is incomplete if we only focus on tax rates instead of how wealth is extracted in the first place. So naturally, the next question is, what do we actually do for people living inside this system right now? This is where universal basic income comes in. Now, I've supported UBI publicly before, but it's been a few months. And every time I do, the same objections show up almost immediately. Quote, the corporations will just raise prices. Landlords will jack up rent. It'll just cause inflation. So let's deal with that head on. First, inflation. Inflation happens when more money is chasing the same constrained supply. But right now, we don't have a supply problem. We have an allocation problem. Corporations are posting record profits. Warehouses are full. Productivity is high. What's missing is purchasing power at the bottom. A UBI doesn't inject money into an overheated economy. It recycles money that's already being extracted and hoarded at the top and puts it back in circulation. And here's the key part people miss. A UBI doesn't give corporations more power. It gives workers more leverage. Right now, if your rent goes up, your grocery spike, or your boss cuts hours, what are your options? Usually none, because you probably can't afford to walk away from a bad job. You're probably one missed paycheck away from being homeless as it is. You can't refuse a bad landlord when you have few other options in terms of affordable accommodation. And you can't say no to price gouging because you still need to survive. A UBI changes that. When people have a guaranteed income floor, they can leave abusive or exploitative jobs. They can refuse wages that don't meet basic living standards, or relocate, retrain, or wait for better opportunities. That forces employers to compete for labor again. And competition, as we talked about in the last video, is what keeps prices and wages in check. Now let's talk about landlords. If landlords could just raise rent because people have more money, they'd already be doing it. They don't wait for policy changes to be greedy. What actually stops rent hikes isn't desperation, it's vacancy risk. When tenants have no financial buffer, they can't move. When they do move, landlords suddenly have to worry about empty units. A UBI increases mobility, and mobility creates market discipline. And this only becomes stronger when paired with rent stabilization, zoning reform, vacancy taxes, and limits on corporate ownership of housing. A UBI isn't meant to work alone. It's meant to work with structural reforms. Another common claim is that people will stop working. But every real-world trial shows the exact opposite. People don't stop working. They stop being trapped. They leave jobs that underpay. They reduce burnout. They start small businesses. They go back to school. They care for family members. In other words, people start making economically rational decisions instead of survival-based ones. And that brings us back to the bigger picture. A UBI is not a reward. It's not charity. It's not socialism sneaking in through the back door either. It's a pressure release valve in an economy where productivity has been disconnected from survival. It acknowledges a simple truth. If the system depends on everyone's participation, then everyone deserves a guaranteed share of the baseline stability that system produces, especially when automation, AI, and consolidation are actively reducing the need for human labor. UBI doesn't replace work. It replaces desperation. And in a system where wealth is increasingly created by ownership, scale, and automation, not wages, tying survival exclusively to employment is no longer rational. So no, a UBI doesn't cause inflation by default. Unchecked corporate power does. And no, it doesn't empower greed. It limits how much greed can exploit people who have no alternative. That's why a UBI makes sense. Not as a silver bullet, but as part of a broader correction to an economy that stopped working for most people a long time ago. Peace out, and if you're not already following me, you should. It's going to be a ride.